think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're a couple minutes after, so we will get going. Welcome, everybody, to the Writing and Media Center Spring 2020 Research Summit. Today, we're going to hear some presentations that originally were prepared for the Midwest Writing Center Association's conference that was supposed to be held in Cedar Rapids, but in light of everything going on, unfortunately was canceled. So I'm pretty excited that we have this platform to hear from all of our lovely undergrads and grad students who are presenting with us today. And then this link will be, the conference will be recorded. The link will be shared out with each of you immediately after the conference. And this will also be posted on the Writing and Media Center's website. So each of the presenters today have worked really hard to collect data on our center and on Iowa State University. The central theme of most of the talks you'll be hearing are going to be on collaboration and community and writing centers. And our researchers have come up with some really interesting interventions that can be taken at centers too. So while we hear from our presenters, the best way to go about this would probably be to turn off all videos and mics if you're not speaking. Historically, we've had some bandwidth issues in WebEx when everybody's on their videos. So that might help with some of the lag problems. But each presentation is going to last about 10 minutes. We do ask that everybody holds their questions until every presenter has given their talk, and then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions. All right, so without further ado, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to Sarah Jones, if that's okay. We're still waiting on Haley to come in, so we're going to switch the order up just a little bit. But Sarah, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share the screen with your poster and start your talk.
All right, sounds good. All right. For my research, I looked into some of the factors that influence how confident students are in their communication abilities, primarily regarding their writing. I was drawn to this topic because it combines a couple of my fields of interest. First and foremost, as a communication consultant, I'm invested in the students I work with, and I want to do everything in my power to help them succeed. Furthermore, as a psychology student, I'm passionate about how people think, and understanding a concept like confidence uncovers a crucial part of our cognitive functioning. And a quick apology for my cat. He's playing with a loud toy, so I'm sorry if you can hear that. So as any good psychology major would do, I started my research process by reviewing the existing literature. Past research has found that confidence in one's communication is related to their competence in communication. So there's this existing relationship in place where low confidence is related to poor communication skills, and high confidence is related to enhanced abilities. Beyond this advantage, I am sure that every person has experienced additional benefits that occur when you become more confident. Public speaking, for example, can be a really daunting task at first, but confidence makes the process much easier. When you're not confident in your abilities to communicate, it's difficult to get started, it's hard to share your work, and it's hard to feel good about your final product. So confidence is clearly an essential aspect of each individual's ability to communicate and express themselves. To better understand what makes students confident communicators, I identified some factors based on my own experiences as a writer and from my time working at the Writing and Media Center as a communication consultant. So utilizing the WMC, the primary variables that I chose to focus upon were motivations for using the Writing Center, concerns that were addressed during a session, and the stage of the writing process when the appointment occurred. To measure this, I divided each of these concepts into a couple of categories. I labeled motivations as either intrinsic or extrinsic. Intrinsic motivations refer to something that's done for its own sake without any reward. So this would be like to learn more about communication. Extrinsic motivations, alternatively, refer to something that is done for some incentive, for example, to get a better grade. Next, I split concerns into higher order concerns and lower order concerns. Higher order concerns in communication are broad global issues with things such as organization or theses, and lower order concerns are smaller, such as grammar or spelling. And then finally, I split the writing process into 4 stages: planning, drafting, revising, and polishing. To collect data, I utilized an online Qualtrics survey that students filled out after completing a session at the WMC. Along with the basic demographic questions that are generally included on the survey, I added questions where students could indicate where they stood on the variables of interest, as well as rating their confidence before the session, after it, and overall. For each of these confidence measures, students rated themselves from 1 for very low confidence to 5 for very high confidence. Over several weeks, 562 students completed my survey, and I coded each of the responses and analyzed them to find differences and trends that existed within the data. The first result that I noticed when conducting my analysis related to the overall role that writing centers play in increasing confidence. If you look at the top graph here, you can see that the red bars represent students' confidence ratings before they had an appointment at the WMC, and the yellow bars show confidence ratings after having an appointment. As you can see, the yellow bars fall primarily into the high and very high ratings, indicating that most students leave the writing center feeling much more confident in their communication abilities. Looking more closely at the data, I found that confidence ratings increased following more than 3/4 of sessions, and that they decreased in less than 1% of instances. Relating this finding to some of my preliminary research, I concluded that by improving confidence, writing centers like the WMC also likely lead to a corresponding increase in communication competence. So this is just one example of the broader role that the WMC plays on the university campus. The next findings that I analyzed were related to some of the specific variables I had previously identified. Looking at figure 2, you can see that the changes in confidence rating following a session are graphed based on whether a student's motivations were intrinsic or extrinsic. The red bars represent students with extrinsic motivations, and the yellow bar represents students with intrinsic motivations. While there's a largely positive trend for each group, there's a more significant increase in confidence for those students with intrinsic motivations. What this means is that when students are motivated to seek assistance due to a desire to learn more or improve outside of grades, they experience a more substantial outcome. I found this to be a noteworthy result. One situation that communication consultants frequently encounter is students coming to the WMC to fulfill a class requirement. While nearly all appointments resulted in increased confidence, students benefit more when they voluntarily choose to use the service. Thus, based on this finding, I would encourage instructors to allow students to use the WMC on their own rather than requiring them to visit the center. The next graph similarly shows confidence changes before and after a session, this time based on the concerns that the students addressed. The yellow bar shows the change for lower order concerns, and the red bar shows the change for higher order concerns. Once again, it's important to recognize that nearly all students had a positive experience with the WMC. But the students that focused on higher order concerns had statistically greater increases in confidence than those who focused on lower order concerns. This finding has another important implication for the functioning of writing centers. There's a tendency for people, students and faculty alike, to view writing centers as a remediation service, rather than a service for learning about writing and becoming a better communicator. Because students benefit more from looking at broader issues, I would encourage them to utilize the WMC to focus on bigger concerns rather than fretting over small ones. By changing the way the writing center is viewed and used, we can more effectively assist the student body. Each of these relationships is reciprocal. That is, as confidence increases, students are more likely to be intrinsically motivated and more likely to focus on higher order concerns. Alternatively, when students are intrinsically motivated and focusing on higher order concerns, their confidence increases. Many communication consultants that work with students over a long period of time can likely support this. Initially, students may come into the WMC to fulfill a class requirement and spend the session fretting about grammar. Over time, they begin utilizing the center to clarify their theses or tweak their organization, all while motivated to intrinsically improve. When this occurs, students become more willing to contribute to the session and share their ideas, further highlighting the benefits of confidence. My last major findings related to the way that motivations and concerns overlap to increase confidence. The bottom 2 graphs show this interaction, both for the entire sample and for international students specifically. The figure on the left indicates that the most important factor for increasing confidence for the entire student body is focusing on higher order concerns, regardless of whether students had intrinsic or extrinsic motivations. Those who addressed higher order concerns, the leftmost bars on the graph, experienced a larger average increase in confidence than those who addressed lower order concerns, the rightmost bars on the graph. The graph on the right shows that this relationship changes for international students. In this population, intrinsic motivations are more important than the concerns that are addressed during a session. That is, international students became more confident when they are motivated intrinsically, regardless of the concerns that they address during a session. Overall, this study effectively clarified some of the psychological underpinnings of students' communication abilities. By encouraging those who use the Writing Center to focus on higher order concerns and develop intrinsic motivations, we can craft a more confident and competent community of communicators. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much for sharing, Sarah. We're going to go ahead and switch over now to our second poster presenters, and that's going to be Haley Spengler and Anna Mir. So when you're ready, go ahead and share the screen with us.
Oh, nice, Anna. Anna, you're still muted, just so you know. Okay. Oh. Thank you for your patience. Okay. Okay. Can you see it, Haley? Is it
Yeah.
good? Okay,
Yeah.
sounds good.
Thank you, ladies.
Okay. So I'll just get started. We're Haley Spengler, and I'm Haley Spengler, and that's Anna. And we did research on the Latinx and Hispanic perceptions of our Writing and Media Center. What basically spiked our interest was there was a heavy, we noticed a heavy lack of Latinx Hispanic students coming in, at least that we could see into our Writing Center. And we also noticed that we were kind of focusing a lot on the Asian populations when forming like cultural classes to train us. So because of this, we wanted to really like look at the Latinx and Hispanic population, our relationship between them and our Writing Center. And to give us some background information, we looked at an article by Lori Salem, and we learned that students make their decisions about whether or not they're going to use services on campus basically before they get to campus. And a lot of this has to do with their identity and how they feel that they fit into the campus environment. So this was really, really interesting to us to kind of take off from there. And so we wanted to uncover this relationship. And to do that, we used a survey through Qualtrics to answer the 3 following questions. How did the Latinx Hispanic students perceive student services and the Writing and Media Center, specifically at Iowa State? Do Latinx Hispanic students use the WMC? Are they using it at all? And does the perception of student services or the Writing and Media Center affect how they're using our services? So that's kind of where we started.
Yeah, and then the next thing that we did, so like Haley said, we did a survey, and about 200 students responded to that. Thankfully, due to our superiors, they provided us basically just a list of all the Latinx Hispanic identifying students at Iowa State. And we kind of separated the questions that we wanted to ask into about 3 categories. We wanted to know their demographic, what year they were, what they were studying, if they used the university-wide services and what services they were using. And then that kind of flowed into a conversation about what the perceptions of the Writing and Media Center were specifically. So some of the sample questions that we ended up asking were what services they were using, whether that was like tutoring or counseling, even the health center. Another question that we asked that we thought was important was we basically asked them in a range that they could respond to was how supported they felt as a Latinx and Hispanic student at Iowa State. Another question was, had they even been to the Writing and Media Center? Had they made an appointment with us? And then the last question, or one of the most important questions that we asked, was on a scale of 1 to 10, how useful they found the Writing and Media Center as a resource.
So based on those four following questions, we just included some of our graphs, but there were a lot more at the presentation that we gave at iScore. But these are some of the most important findings. So to start off, we looked at how Iowa State students that identify as Latinx or Hispanic feel on a scale of strongly agree or strongly disagree about their support on campus. So most of the students either felt pretty indifferent or like semi-agree that they were feeling supported on campus. And so then we took that and looked at how supported they felt and compared it to how they felt about representation within the services that they're using, specifically the Writing Media Center. So the students that were not feeling supported found it more important to be represented, their identity be represented in the services, whereas the student who felt supported already got that support that they needed, so they didn't feel it was as important to be represented in the Writing Center. Then we looked at whether or not they had been to the Writing Center and then how useful they found the service to be. When the students hadn't been to the Writing Center, about half of them thought that we were not a useful service at all. They maybe had negative feelings about us. So that kind of shows a lot. Whereas when the students had been to the Writing Center, over half of them found us to be a useful service and had very positive feelings about us. And then with the use of campus services, we compared whether or not they use them and then how useful they find us as a Writing Center. So when the students are not using campus services at all, 56% of them, I think that says, thought that also the Writing Media Center is not useful. And then when they were using the services, they were more likely to feel that we were useful. So we really focused on like their use of the services and then comparing them to like how that makes them perceive us as like our major findings.
So the conclusions that we gathered from all this data, the first one and the biggest one that we were kind of surprised to see was that people who do go to the WMC have a better perception, and those who have never been to the Writing Media Center are actually actively against the Writing Media Center rather than what we would have assumed to be more indifferent. They have a negative feeling towards it. Another thing that we saw was that those who feel like they aren't as supported with representation at Iowa State, they do desire more representation in their services. And then the last big conclusion that we came to with this data was that people who had come to the Writing and Media Center do think that we could benefit from having more staff that represents themselves and other cultures. And the recommendations that we have moving forward for this, our first one was just more outreach. This can mean just doing more workshop presentations like what we have been doing, but we could do it, focusing more on Latinx Hispanic clubs. We could have a Writing and Media Center liaison for certain classes. We could do dorm and residential outreach just to specific dorms. And then we could also even present Iowa State's orientation, which kind of goes back to Lori Salem's statement that students already have their mind made up whether they're going to be using services or not, even before classes start. And then our second recommendation was to do more research. And we were planning on interviewing about 10 students just to get more of their say, why they picked what they picked in the survey, and just gain more insight. Unfortunately, due to external circumstances, that can't happen. But next year, if Haley wants to continue this, more interviews could be done, and just hearing more the voices from that community. And that's about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay,
Great.
how do I end this?
Thank you, Haley and Anna. And yeah, we certainly are excited to see if Haley continues with this research in the fall. Hopefully things are settled down a little bit here at Iowa State, so those kinds of qualitative methods can be used. All right, up next, we're going to have Amanda Arp and Dr. Sauer give their presentation that focuses on online consultations.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Can you see my screen?
You are good.
All right, excellent. All right, then. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Sauer, and Amanda Arp is here with me. Amanda, are you here?
Yes.
Excellent.
Hello, everyone.
And we're going to talk a little bit about this theoretical model, which we want to advocate for, which we think will help students and tutors work better with students in writing and media work on the Iowa State campus. We wanted to problematize a model that I've found in 30 years of teaching college student writing about how they think about what it is they're doing when they're writing papers for classes. They have this straight line model, which we're going to problematize in some ways, and suggest that everyone involved, including instructors of writing, tutors, and students themselves, will benefit if they switch to a looped or a circular model of thinking about what it is they're doing when they're writing. And so we're going to talk about that just a bit.
So in the vast majority of composition courses, students are often tasked with writing various types of assignments, and during this process, they're expected to create and produce a deliverable that is then provided to the instructor. And so this process creates a very linear production model for the students. The production in writing starts with the student and ends with the instructor. So given this very linear goal, it's no wonder that students might prefer a simpler version of composing that doesn't add any additional complexities. So the most striking problem with this mindset is that when the writing process encourages linear development, activities like in-class peer review or going to the Writing and Media Center to meet with a tutor or consultant become these distractive moments during the writing process. So for this and other reasons, this model is pretty ugly and doesn't really provide some of the opportunities and to grow in a particular mindset that our model that we've developed and are going to be talking about today does. So the issue is that this model is incredibly common and seemingly clear to students who have likely crafted assignments for a variety of classes in this very same kind of linear mode. So for them, this is very clear. Students produce commodities and receive grades in return, rather than engaging in a more back and forth conversation with their actual audience. And so the papers and their grades become commodities. And this model is particularly problematic in this age that we find ourselves in of COVID-19, when the sense of an instructor or even their peers is less direct than it has been in the past.
Luckily for us, theoreticians have been discussing problems with that linear model for decades, and we can build upon that to talk about ways in which we could teach composition, we could teach students how to write, and then we can support them and work with them in ways that are in keeping with the best thinking in the field. One of the 1960s seminal works in this area is Roland Barthes' piece on work and text. Barthes in the 1960s suggested that there were two ways of thinking about writing. One is the work, which is that commodified piece of writing that you hand over to someone else and which then gets assessed and judged in that way. And a more complicated model, which he argued in favor of, the text, which is a shared collaborative model whose meaning is determined by a community and which is much more complicated than the simple direct model that students sometimes prefer. The text engages interest and it gathers meaning from the people who are circulating and discussing those. Now that's very abstract, but what it means in a contemporary age is that we can benefit from things like websites, which require constant updating and revision on the basis of how audiences are receiving documents. And we can talk about the ways in which students should be writing pieces with the notion of continually improving them and updating them on the basis of how they're being circulated, how they're functioning and working inside of actual audiences. And that leads us to a model we want to encourage everybody to think about, and we want to encourage Writing and Media Center tutors to talk about, which is a model of thinking about papers as a circle rather than a line. The student is the sort of originator at first moment at the top of the circle, but just like a traditional old clock, it proceeds from them. It can move to the right to in-class peer reviewers as a next stage of writing, and the feedback you get from the students, from peer reviewers, helps to improve the quality of the work and changes the document into something other than what it was before. The Writing Center tutor, similarly, when students meet with them, provide input that allows the paper to become something other than what it was before. In this stage, the instructor then is the next stage of people who are looking at the document. But we encourage students to then think about distributing the document to larger audiences, to a larger community, and then to continue thinking about revising and improving it on the basis of the feedback they get at every stage. And this is increasingly common in the ways in which dominant fields in our world talk about working on documents. Usability theory, for instance, talks about a very cyclical circular model in which you're constantly increasing the usability of the documents you produce. Things like websites require analysis and tweaking in terms of the planning that you do, analysis and probing into the questions that have to be answered inside of web documents. But then you produce the document and then you go back and continue to improve it and recycle it through multiple stages. These make the document better and better, and this circular model is one which is becoming quite common for writing outside of academic instances. Another model that's becoming increasingly common inside of universities is design thinking, which is another sort of iterative model which thinks about working on documents through multiple interfaces with audiences. You show them drafts, you work on prototypes, and you take the feedback you get from audiences to improve those documents quite a bit. Even if students come into talking with tutors in ways that are that traditional linear model, we could refer to these other sorts of dominant and emerging theories to talk about the ways in which what we're doing is in fact a much more contemporary, much more interesting, and much more substantial improvement to their work.
Indeed. So in our effort to achieve a more Barthian version of the writing process, in terms of thinking about work and text, this compositional loop between students and peer reviewers, and writing consultants and instructors, one of the main benefits is that it's going to help build a shared sense of online community around the text. And so this can really help encourage a multi-stage writing process that can function even in online situations. And so in this way, writing centers can certainly be a valuable partner in students' writing development in a lot of ways. So we believe this form of writing process is going to help shift students away from the paradigm that kind of rewards the linear production of text in favor of a more cyclical model that would allow for higher quality compositions. But there are a few potential drawbacks to this kind of situation. So as Lunsford mentions, building a collaborative environment is also difficult because getting the work and the time of individuals behind that can also be difficult, especially considering the drop-in nature of many writing centers. So in a way that we can work against that potential issue by remembering that online and in-person connections can be really effective and can tie in nicely to the goals that a writing center already has. So for example, online and in-person connections can happen in the composition course, it can happen between professors and students, it can happen between writing consultants and students. And so then one of the main benefits of the cyclical process is that it provides this user for writers to work against. And these online connections also allow for greater accessibility for individuals. And I think that ties in well to a lot of the focuses that the writings, at least our writing center has, and many other writing centers also have.
There's some material advantages to this model, which is, among other things, it allows us to incorporate the sorts of collaborative word processing that students like so much these days, using software packages like Google Docs or Microsoft Word's version of Google Docs, the collaborative system built into Microsoft Office 365 now, or Apple Pages or WordPress, which is common in some of the English assignments. All of those collaborative word processors work nicely inside this cyclical improvement model, because you can have a document which you share, it invites comments, which don't require that the writer stop working. They get to get the comments, and then they can go back at any point and take a look at the comments and suggestions that are incorporated into the document and accept or reject those and make changes on those bases. Instead of having students think of collaboration then as a sort of a secretive outside of class alternative model, if the cyclical model allows instructors to see this as part of the exact process. And it then becomes possible, in fact, even for instructors to ask to see the entire system of the entire history of revisions to a paper in some way, so that they could build off of the notion of whether students improve their paper based on the feedback they got from in-class peer reviewers or from writing center tutors. Most contemporary learning management systems, though, just encourage students to work in their word processor, download a doc file, and upload that doc file into the LMS. Certainly Canvas does that. But we have some new and emerging tools that allow the sharing of collaborative Google Docs or Office 365 live sharing. And what we wanted to do here is to encourage writing media center tutors to begin to encourage students to use those, so that instead of the static document, the static Word document that gets turned into an instructor, a document which contains still within it the entire history of its revisions becomes submitted to the instructor, so the instructor can see that history. This allows us to link the LMS to the live text model about the collaborative document.
So, in consideration of the many benefits and the way that this model will fit into potentially our university and others, we do want to notice that there are a few additional challenges to using this sort of process within a writing center. So a lot of writing centers are already stretched pretty thin and have to argue for funding and against the common assumption of them as a drop-in service. So online appointments, one of the benefits of this model is that it can play into some of the goals that the writing centers already have. So the online appointments are often more accessible, and really when we're thinking about, Fitzgerald and Inyata's point that writing centers want to teach good writing processes, this cycle can play into that and allow the Writing and Media Center to continue to live up to its goals, and can also help to create that greater collaboration. So we also wish to acknowledge some of, the current situation that our university and process is within. So if we're thinking about this cyclical model within a situation like we have now, it's the infrastructure of using online connections can be really wise. It's also useful to protect students and tutors, as well as help ensure the reliability and consistency of tutor hours in this kind of emergency situation.
So we're running short on time. We'll just make a few brief recommendations. We want to suggest that over the summer, the Writing and Media Center community could plan to meet with faculty members from departments to implement test courses that could begin to implement these sorts of cycles. This would involve teaching instructors how to use the shared collaborative documents that use the whole entire history of edits in them. And then we want to encourage everybody to talk about them in similar ways, so that we can begin to produce this notion of community supporting this idea.
So at the end, we believe that we have responded to Fitzgerald and Mignata's call for tutors to be researching and producing more knowledge regarding online consultations.
We have a couple of pages of citations, but thank you very much. Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Amanda and Dr. Sauer, for sharing that with us. And so last but certainly not least, we do have Margaret Koss, who will be presenting on graduate students in the Writing and Media Center.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself before sharing my screen. Now I'm going to pull it up. All right. So hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I am doing research or presenting my research on shaping pedagogy and praxis, so graduate students within the Writing Center. So I come to the WMC from a background in higher education and student affairs, so I look a lot at student development. So when I was starting out, one of my biggest questions was, okay, well, I'm a graduate student in the Writing Center. I may end up working in writing centers, but I also might not. But how am I focus a lot on like how my work aids me in growing and how the work that my fellow graduate students, the work that they're doing helps them shape their praxis and helps them shape their kind of ideological approaches to the work that they do. And so with that, my first question when I came into looking at research was to say, okay, well, what research exists within Writing Center research about how graduate students are developing or how graduate students are existing within writing centers? And a lot of the research that I found was about what benefits graduate students are to writing centers and not how are writing centers benefiting graduate students who are working in them. So that was kind of my first question. And what I found in how graduate students are benefits is that they're approachable. Oftentimes undergraduate students can see them a little bit as a peer, kind of this in between the professor and the student. They have a little bit more knowledge, they have a deep knowledge of the writing process, but they're also students as well. And so it can feel a little bit less intimidating to approach a graduate student than to approach their professor for feedback on writing in between the assignment of a document and the turning in of a document. But I found that there was a gap in the literature on how working in writing centers aids graduate students in their development. And so for me, the questions that were kind of popping up in my head was, what role does working in a writing center play in the development of grad students? What professional development opportunities exist, and how are we as the admin team helping provide those opportunities? Where does the learning take place? Does it take place in those graduate courses? Or are they also learning pieces from the work that they're doing, whether that's learning professionally or personally? And then finally, how, like the culmination of all of these questions is, how does work in a writing center shape a person's pedagogy and praxis? So going into this, I was using my student affairs brain, and I thought, okay, what framework can I use? And my theoretical framework that I chose was Baxter Magolda's theory of self-authorship. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a student development theory. It's looking at how do individuals develop, and at the basis of it, there's three main questions that individuals are asking and that different experiences will shape. And so those are, how do I know? It's this epistemological question of, how do I know the things that I know? Where am I getting my fonts of knowledge from? Who am I? So that's that interpersonal, like understanding your identity and how it fits within society. And then the third is, how do I construct relationships, which is the intrapersonal. How do you interact with other people based on your identity, based on the experiences that you have had? And so when I was looking at those three questions, I felt that of the questions that I was forming, they aligned pretty well with the three prongs of Baxter Magolda's theory of self-authorship. So the first is that epistemological meaning making of, like, how do I know what I know and how am I making meaning of the environments around me? And that second one is the pedagogical development. These are the ideologies that I believe in. These are the ethics that I have when I approach work. And then the final one is, how do I construct relationships? How do I put all the thoughts that are in my brain into practice? And so those are the three dimensions of the study that I'm kind of looking at. For this study, the methodology I took, it was a qualitative approach. It was definitely a start. I think that this research needs to be continued at other institutions and potentially in other types of graduate offices to see how different types of work help graduate students grow and develop as individuals as they're going to become professionals. And so I interviewed a few of the graduate students who work in the Writing and Media Center, and I asked questions that were designed to address those three prongs of self-authorship, so that epistemological, the interpersonal, and the intrapersonal. Some of the questions I had asked was, how has your work in the WMC shaped your approach to learning in other areas? How does being a GCC shape your career path? And then in what ways have you learned and grown since the beginning of working at the WMC? I'm going to recognize that not all of our graduate students want to go on the same career path, so that's why it's important to understand, how does working here give you tools or transferable skills to other places. So of all the interviews that I had quite a few, and then I ended up reading all the interviews, getting them transcribed, and then coding. And from the coding, there were about 5 themes, I think. I can't count right now, thinking. But we'll go through all of the themes. But some of the themes fit under different prongs of the self-authorship model. But the themes that I felt fit under meaning making were learning and professional development, which I think go hand in hand, because when you're learning intellectual pieces, you're also developing your professional approach. Then for the praxis prong, it was holistic approach, professional development, and teaching. And then for pedagogical development, I felt that rapport building and connection with students was a huge piece, as was that holistic approach. And so, yeah, I'll continue talking. But so for the learning piece, I'm going to give you all a little bit of time to just like read the quotes, so you don't have to pay attention to me talking and reading. So when I was collecting the data or having conversations with graduate students, I felt that for a lot of them, the way they were learning, yes, there was learning in the classroom, but some of them aren't taking classes anymore. And really, they're doing a lot of their dissertation writing, their thesis writing, doing a lot of their practical work. And so for them, a lot of their learning was happening in the Writing and Media Center, whether that was working directly with students, shaping their teaching philosophies. Also, something that came up a lot in our conversations was how graduate students would talk about how, in this setting, I'm learning from the undergraduates. I'm learning from the undergraduates that I work with. I'm learning from the undergraduates that I'm a consultant with. And a lot of them kind of talked about, like, I didn't come into this situation expecting to learn from undergraduates, but sometimes I'm like, oh, when we're in a consultation and I see a student use kind of an argument layout or how they approach an argument is not something that I would have thought of. And then again, when they're working with their coworkers, their colleagues, the undergraduate communication consultants, one participant talked really clearly about how, like, sometimes those undergraduates they're not intimidated by you because they know you within that working setting. And so they're like, that like 6-word subject form sentence, I can't think of grammatical terms right now, but they'd be like, that doesn't make sense and it's not necessary. You're using way too many words to get something across. And so sometimes it was really, they talked a lot about how, like, they learned from their peers in that they just learned more about communication, and you can always have more to learn in communication. So that was something that was very prominent in the conversations that I had. The next one was professional development, and this goes hand in hand with that learning. But oftentimes it came from the professional development of doing consultant observations. So this year we had our graduate communication consultants observe our undergraduate communication consultants and give them feedback, and ask, kind of having those conversations about how do you give constructive criticism to an undergraduate, to a person that is also your colleague. And so for that emerged in almost every single conversation I had, as I learned a lot from that because I've never been in that feedback form of working with an employee. Yes, they give feedback to clients, but it looks a little bit different than professional feedback. And so that was something that emerged as, in terms of, there's professional development with doing client observations. There's also professional development when doing research. And that was something that research potential was not something that they had really thought of when accepting a job at the WMC. But this year there's really been a focus on, if you're interested in doing research, you can definitely do that. And so for them, it opened up the door of, I came to grad school thinking maybe I would be a teacher, maybe I would go into publishing, but now I can see research as an option as well. And so that has been a really great service of working at the WMC. Another theme was the holistic approach. And this was something that I definitely wanted to ask because our program, the WMC, is housed within the Dean of Students office, and the Dean of Students office always wants to help cyclones succeed, take a holistic approach, and that emphasis on a holistic approach also emerged in the conversations that I had with graduate students. And so for some, it was thinking more, like trying as much as possible to empathize with where the students were, of, maybe they have other things going on when I'm teaching this English 150 or English 250 class. I'm able to get more in this idea of how can I connect them to resources on campus, because that's what I'm doing in my consultations with students. But additionally, there was a conversation around holistic approach for themselves too. It wasn't just, I'm a graduate student, I have to do my research, I have to come in, I have to get published, I have to take classes, I have to teach. It was also, no, there's more to me too. I am a graduate student, but I'm also a person, and how can I take care of myself and have self-care? And that was something that was modeled by the admin team, by the Dean of Students office, of you exist in more than the entity of as a student. And so that was something that was really cool to see emerge from the responses. And that the top quote, it says, creating those spaces so that I'm not constantly thinking about work, prioritizing exercise and eating well and getting enough sleep. Those things we're talking about, like if they are talking to their students about taking care of themselves, but they themselves are not taking care of themselves, they can't role model that way of self-care, holistically understanding that you're well in all areas of your life. And so that was something that was a very cool result. Another theme that emerged was this idea of teaching, and something that a lot of the graduate students that I interviewed with, they also taught English 150 or English 250 courses. And so they would have the experience of working with a large group of students, as well as the experience of working with students of one-on-one. And something that helped a lot for them was working one-on-one with students, because then they knew if they had an English 150 student come in as a consultant to the WMC, they then knew, okay, well, maybe this isn't the only student who's struggling with this assignment in this way. How can I bring that to my classroom to talk about, so that this student raised the concern? I'm sure there are other students in my course who have similar concerns, or in other English 150 courses or English 250 courses that have concerns. And so always trying to shape their approach to teaching to reflect what they were experiencing in their consultations. So maybe there was confusion about prompts. How can they clear that with their class? So that was something that emerged as well. Another theme was building rapport and connection with a student. Something that a lot of the interviews talked about was seeing students grow. Oftentimes at the Writing Center, we have clients who come in, they'll come in the first time and then they're like, wow, that was a really good experience. I'm going to come back in and see that same person. And so there's a connection that is built between the communication consultant and the student, in that this is a person who they start trusting their communication consultant. They start seeing what they can bring to the table. And so seeing that way of, how can I, even if I just see the student for one session, how can I make sure that they're comfortable? Checking in on the whole person, asking like how their day is, and making sure that if they need connection to resources, they can connect to them. And then there was one final piece. I didn't have a theme for it, but I did want to leave off on this quote because I felt it was very much a reflection of the experience of graduate students within the Writing and Media Center. And so this participant said, I barely knew what I wanted to do before coming to the Writing and Media Center. And now my whole future is shaped around writing. I think that's a pretty cool thing that happened. Just having such a supportive environment around me made me really love the topic that I already loved. I already loved writing and editing and helping students. So being in this type of environment was really helpful for me to figure out my life path. So prior to this individual coming to work in the Writing Center, they didn't know that this could be a career path for them. And so I think that shows the value of working within the Writing Center. And I think there is a lot of work that the Writing Center does in terms of graduate student development. And I think to increase working on that, I'd recommend increasing research opportunities and increasing professional development opportunities, whether that's client consultation, observations, and then constructive feedback from that, or finding other ways to give the graduate students more professional growth. Right. Any questions?
Thank you, Margaret. And
yeah,
we will go ahead and open this up to questions for any of our presenters. We only have about 10 minutes left. We can run a little bit over, but I do understand if folks need to get going right on the dot at 3 o'clock. So if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat box or to turn your video and mic on.
Hello.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Hello.
Hi.
All right. So I had a question for Sarah Jones. her research made the argument that students perform better when they voluntarily enter the writing center, and I definitely agree with that. But one of the issues we have is that we are sort of unseen on campus a lot of times. So what do you think about the idea of faculty members requiring students to come to the writing center and then us winning them over with our charm functionally? This has sort of been a debate that's existed a little bit. So I'm just curious to think about your thoughts. Since we have such positive reviews all the time, could we potentially use that as a way to get students into our center? I'm just curious to hear what you think. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would be an effective way to draw students in and, like you said, use our charm to win them over, just because, yeah, the vast majority of sessions did result in an overall increase in students' confidence. So any way that we can get them like into our center is going to be effective. So yeah, that initial requirement definitely would be like a valid reason to get them to come in, and then being able to win them over and switch them to an intrinsic motivation would be like the ideal outcome.
Okay, thank you very much.
I had a question this is Joseph Cheadle. I had a question for Margaret. Margaret, did you see any negative effects in your study?
Okay. That was something that really didn't emerge. I think overall, the graduate students, there were conversations of sometimes not having a ton of guidance when they did get like extra projects or extra pieces, and so not knowing what to do from there. But for the most part, there was a lot of appreciation for the growth that they had within the Writing and Media Center.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for Jeff. Make sure we call him Jeff for sure. I really liked towards the end there when you started getting about those recommendations that Amanda offered that were originally for the MWCA audience about considering partnering with your English faculty or communication departments. Maybe you could expand on what some of those partnerships might look like, or what you both sort of had in mind.
Amanda?
So one thing that we were thinking about was that there could potentially be a test 150 or 250 that could, like, one of us consultants could be tasked with, like, you know, that could be part of our responsibility, and could potentially be part of that conversation over a couple of the assignments, just to see how that would go. So that's a potential way to kind of practice and test out this cycle. Do you have
If I could suggest something based on my experience in the past, I have a lot of history of my scholarly work in bibliographic instruction, which is a fancy way of saying going to the librarian and getting the librarian to help students understand how to use the library. And one of the things we found in early research I did a lot in my teaching career involved instructors coming up with new ways of teaching students to try to talk to librarians and have them go talk to the reference librarians. And then having the reference librarians who didn't know that students would begin doing this be taken aback and not respond using the new ways that teachers would try to teach students how to interact better with librarians. What has to happen is that you've got everybody on the same page if you come up with a new way of thinking about teaching students. If students have a problematic way of thinking about the Writing Center or peer reviewing or writing their classes, their papers for their classes for teachers, what we have to do is have the teachers talking the same language as the students who are going to be doing peer reviewing, using the same language as Writing and Media Center tutors, so that every bit of that is involved in developing and extending the students' sense in their heads as to what it is they're doing when they're writing a paper. And so I think we'd be much better off if we could sit down in a room together and try with a sample class, coming up with exactly similar language so that Writing Center support personnel, consultants, can then speak the same kind of language about what it is that students should be doing when they're writing. And my thought is if we were to try that a little bit, we might be able to have some success with that and then broaden and expand it further if it works.
Yeah, that would certainly provide focus to a lot of these ideas.
That's great. Thank you. we only have a couple more minutes. If we have one final short question, we can have that asked at this time. Otherwise, feel free to email myself or anyone in the admin team, and we can reach out to our presenters also. But any final thoughts for the good of the group? Yeah, Amanda.
So I do have a question for Haley and Anna. You were talking about the Latinx and Hispanic perceptions of the Writing and Media Center, and I was wondering, kind of based off of that data and any of your experiences, where do you think would be the best, like where's the best moment for intervention in terms of making people more aware of those opportunities, making them feel more welcome? What do you think about that?
Yeah.
My thought was getting advisors involved with it. Like when students first have their orientation at Iowa State, just having the advisors like explicitly tell the students that these are the services that are available. You can use the Writing Center. Here's like an email of a consultant that you can contact if you have any trouble with like writing anything. Just making it a lot more personal and a lot more direct right from the beginning, I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that also, like there's about 1 billion breakout sessions at orientation where you go and talk to a ton of different people about like campus resources and things like that. And so possibly having like one of our admin team to be a representative at one of those sessions would be great too, just to get that early knowledge out there for the students so that they know about us like earlier, like Anna said.
All right, great, thank you. So I think this does wrap up our time for our conference today. Thank you everybody who presented, and thank you those of you who were able to make it in today. We will be sharing out a link with you, hopefully later this afternoon, of the conference, since we did record it, and it will also be available to view on the Writing and Media Center's website. All right, hope everybody has a great weekend. Feel free to email anybody in the admin team if you have additional questions about any of the talks that you heard today. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Carolyn.